Hello, Tributes, and welcome to episode 10 of Ashes of the Hunger Games. In the last few videos, we went over the 195th Hunger Games, and today we will be going over the 196th to 199th Hunger Games. Before I begin, I would like to thank Christian Blanco and Laura McCouch, who made Tales of the Hunger Games and Pan Am Reborn, respectively. I would also like to thank Andrew McLean for making a lot of the art used in this video. Without those three people, a lot of this series would not be possible. So, thank you, and let's get into the video. Another thing, before I begin, a trigger warning. This video will contain mentions of the following in one or more games: homophobia, pedophilia, rape, PTSD, and intense descriptions / depictions of death. But that last one's to be expected with a Hunger Games story. I just thought I'd put it in there. Watch at your own risk. The 196th Games takes place in the year 260. After last year's highly successful quinquennial quell and the first District 14 victor in the Ashes Files, the capital was excited to see what the 196th Hunger Games would bring. This year, Districts 4 and 7 were picked to send in the extra female tribute, and Districts 1 and 15 were picked to send in the extra male tribute. These are the mentors for the 196th Games. If any of y'all are curious, you can pause here and read through them at your own leisure. This year's victor was 16-year-old Birch Kim from District 7. After the death of her little sister Dove last year, Birch was ready to get some old-fashioned revenge. This year, District 7 received a record amount of volunteers from the district: 50 female volunteers and 45 male volunteers. Birch and her twin brother Oak were amongst the younger volunteers this year, with the youngest volunteer being 15-year-old Sequoia Adams. Out of all the females, two stood out. These two just so happened to be the youngest ones there. Sequoia and Birch both stood out for completely different reasons. One would think that both of them stood out for being related to previous tributes, with Sequoia actually being the niece of famed victor Jack Jordan, but this was not the case. Birch stood out for being related to Dove from the previous Hunger Games, and she hit the most targets in the axe-throwing section of the volunteer games. Meanwhile, Sequoia hit more bullseyes with the axes than even Birch did, cementing her spot in the interview round. During the interview round, Sequoia was quite nervous, but she still managed to answer all the questions with a sort of adorable nature to her. Meanwhile, Birch was the most confident girl in the interviews. After a few moments of interviewing the girls, it was decided that Birch and Sequoia would be this year's female tributes for District 7. After it was determined that Oak Kim would be the male tribute of District 7, it was time for the visitations. Birch would be visited by her uncle, Niall Sallow. As Niall came into the room, Birch screamed and tried to tell peacekeepers to keep him out, but the peacekeepers wouldn't listen. While in the room, Niall told Birch to remember her position in the Kim family, which made Birch start to quietly sob as Niall was escorted out of the room. On the train, Birch distanced herself from Oak and Sequoia. Oak tried to talk to Birch, but she didn't ever respond to him. Eventually, Hollis and Jack came into the main train compartment and started to talk with the tributes. Although both of them tried to talk to Birch, she never replied. Instead, she ran off to the bathroom in the train, having gotten sick. During training, Birch looked around the individual training room she was placed in. She didn't really want to survive the games, feeling terrible about what her uncle had done to her before the reapings happened. After a little while of her just looking around, she was escorted out of the room and escorted back to her accommodation room. When she arrived in her accommodation room, Stella from 1, Valor from 1, Titan from 1, Caesarea from 2, Remus from 2, Serena from 4, Sailor from 4, Xander from 4, Rasper from 10, and Vivian from 12 were already talking with Oak and Sequoia. As soon as Birch arrived, however, the conversation stopped abruptly. Birch immediately found this suspicious until Remus approached her and pinned her to the wall, as he continued by stating that he knew what Birch's uncle had done to her. The way he was treating Birch made the girls in the room and Oak very uncomfortable. As Remus goes to caress Birch's cheek, Birch slaps Remus in the face, causing both her and Remus to be surprised by this. Remus then grabbed Birch in a chokehold and started to lift her up the wall. Before he could do anything else, however, Oak ran over to Remus and punched him in the stomach, hard. When Remus let go of Birch, Sequoia, Stella, Caesarea, Serena, Sailor, and Vivian ran over to Birch and helped her up off the ground. The girls and Oak then all said that they were leaving the Career Alliance if this is how the girls would be treated. Oak and Sequoia then kicked Valor, Titan, Remus, Xander, and Rasper out of the room. After the boys left, Birch glared at Oak. Oak gave Birch a questioning look, about to ask why she was mad even though he had saved her. Before he could say this, though, Birch spoke first. She asked Oak how Remus could have possibly known what their uncle did to her if Oak was the only one in the room who knew. Oak tried to apologize, but it was too late. Birch slowly shook her head at Oak before running off to her room. After Birch disappeared into her room, the girls scolded Oak too, saying that it wasn't Oak's story to tell. After saying this, Stella, Caesarea, Serena, Sailor, Sequoia, and Vivian went to Birch's room to check on her. After a few hours, it was time for the solo evaluations. For Birch's solo evaluation, she threw 12 axes at 12 different targets. Birch used her anger to her advantage and hit 10 out of 12 of the targets. Birch would end up walking out of the room with a training score of 10. On the night of the interviews, Birch stood backstage in a nice red dress. As the interviews went on, the boys from 1 weren't utterly terrible when it came to what they heard about Birch. In fact, the boys from 1 said nothing about it, even when Tia and Mia asked them if they knew anything interesting about the other tributes. Meanwhile, it was Remus's interview that went terribly. It didn't take much, but Remus ended up just telling the crowd that Birch was pregnant. Although Remus wouldn't elaborate on this topic, Sequoia and Vivian could tell that Birch was utterly mortified. When it was Birch's turn, she came out onto the interview stage to cheers and jeers from the crowd. Some capital people in the crowd yelled about the unfairness of having a pregnant girl in the games. Meanwhile, others cheered, hoping she would win. As Birch's interview went on, it was evident she was still embarrassed after what Remus had said. She was short and quiet with Mia and Tia until her interview ended. The next day, the tributes were taken to their launch rooms under the arena. When Hollis came into her launch room, she saw Birch crying. She tried to approach her to wish her luck in the games, but Birch shook her head and just muttered, "Don't." After a few moments of silence, Hollis sighed and left the room to go visit Sequoia. After a few more minutes, Birch was told to get into her launch tube, which she did without protest. She was then lifted up into the arena. This year, the games took place in an arena known as Lava Lakes. The weather was acid rain. The main event was an eruption. The games lasted for 4 days, and the notable mutts were molten turtles. When the tributes were lifted into the arena, the scalding heat immediately got to some tributes. As Birch looked around, she noticed that the podiums were on the edge of a lava lake, and the cornucopia was in the center of the large lava lake, with bridges connecting the podiums and the cornucopia. When the gong sounded, Birch went to run in until she noticed Remus was right next to her, also running into the cornucopia. This realization caused Birch to pause in her tracks. As Remus got to the cornucopia, he grabbed a sword and immediately decapitated Sequoia. As Birch saw this, she continued to stay frozen in fear. Remus then looked in Birch's direction and smirked, sliding his fingers across his throat in a menacing manner. Just then, Valor tackled Birch to the ground from behind her and began to choke her out. As Birch was starting to lose consciousness, Oak tackled Valor off of Birch. As Birch tried to catch her breath, Sailor helped Birch up off of the ground before receiving a sword through her skull from Titan. Birch would scream at this and try to run away, but Rasper grabbed her and threw her onto the ground, knocking the breath out of her. Birch tried to scream for her allies, but nothing escaped her lips. She thought this was gonna be the end until Rasper received a throwing knife in the heart thrown by Caesarea. Serena then helped Birch off of the ground as Oak killed Valor. Stella, Caesarea, Serena, Birch, Oak, and Vivian reunited with each other and ran away from the cornucopia. As the group got far enough away from the cornucopia, Birch stopped and found something to lean against to catch her breath. As she was catching her breath, Stella stated that she had found out that the career boys had gotten the boys from 6, 8, and 9 to join them. This angered the rest of the group. Even Oak was angry about this, although he was the only boy in this alliance. As this group talked, they didn't know that the other all-girl alliance was nearby. This actual all-girls alliance composed of Memory from 3, Ellen from 5, Michigan from 6, Luma from 8, Nut from 9, and Ivory from 11. Meanwhile, the alliance composed of the tributes from Districts 14 and 15 was also nearby. This alliance composed of Ellie from 14, Patrick from 14, Denise from 15, Salim from 15, and Robert from 15. When midnight arrived, the fallen tributes were shown in the sky. The portraits of Sequoia from 7, Sailor from 4, Rasper from 10, Valor from 1, the boy from 12, and the boy from 5 were shown in the sky. As Birch and the other anti-careers saw Sequoia and Sailor's pictures in the sky, they had a moment of silence for them. This continued until they heard a scream and a cannon nearby. Just then, Memory, Michigan, Luma, Nut, and Ivory ran around to the corner of a hill of ashes near the anti-career camp. At this point, Ellie, Patrick, Denise, Salim, and Robert also ran into the anti-career camp. These groups then prepared their weapons, causing the anti-careers who had weapons to do the same. Just then, Michigan saw Birch and the alliance and immediately told her allies to put their weapons down. This move confused both the anti-careers and the European group until Denise also noticed Birch was there and she too told her allies to put their weapons away. As these groups put their weapons down, the anti-careers also put their weapons down. After this, Nut started to cry, stating that Gladiolas, from 11, had killed Ellen. As Nut cried, the girls all hugged her, while Oak, Patrick, Salim, and Robert kept an eye out for the apparently dangerous solos this year. The only remaining soloists this year were Elemento from 3, Tijuana from 10, and Gladiolas. All three of these soloists were very strong and fast on their feet. Meanwhile, the anti-careers had a pregnant woman in their alliance, and the all-girls alliance had 2. The European alliance was the only one of the 3 alliances there that seemed like they were well built to take on not only the solos, but the careers as well. As the groups talked, one trio of girls got closer to each other than the rest. This trio was Michigan, Birch, and Ivory. This trio was the trio of girls that were pregnant. Birch was the furthest along of the 3, being in her 3rd trimester already. Just then, Gladiolas burst into the anti-career camp and immediately stabbed Patrick in the stomach. As Patrick's cannon sounded, the others in the camp took action. Birch ran in first, being pushed to the ground by the extremely muscular Gladiolas. The boy from 11 then ran at Salim and stabbed him in the brain, sounding his cannon. As her district partner and trusted confidant died, Denise ran at Gladiolas with Ellie and Robert. This trio then fought together to take down Gladiolas, Denise being the one to perform the killing blow. That night, Oak and Birch agreed with the other anti-careers that the All-Girls Alliance and the 14s and 15s could prove very helpful for them, and they all agreed to join forces. By the evening of the 3rd day, all the solos had been killed by the Allies, although they lost Ellie, Robert, Memory, and Nut in the process. Meanwhile, the careers were still going strong with the same 6 members they had left after the bloodbath. Titan from 1, Remus from 2, Xander from 4, Australis from 6, Flax from 8, and Harvest from 9. Birch, Michigan, and Ivory had all began to get suspicious of the people they had once called allies, getting closer to the end than they were before. After Birch snuck off with Michigan and Ivory, they heard 5 cannons. These 5 cannons belonged to Caesarea, Luma, Denise, Stella, and Serena, after Oak and Vivian had turned on the Alliance. The pair would then set out to find Michigan, Birch, and Ivory. As the trio of girls avoided Oak and Vivian, President Flickerman came onto the intercoms in the arena and stated that there would be a feast where bags would be presented on a table, filled with items the tributes needed the most. As President Flickerman got off of the comms, Birch, Michigan, and Ivory followed Oak and Vivian to the cornucopia. Here, Oak and Vivian would grab their bags before seeing Titan and Remus approaching them with their weapons out. Birch, Michigan, and Ivory then watched Oak and Vivian fight for their lives, actually managing to kill Remus and Titan, before Australis snuck up behind the pair and killed them. After this fight, there were only 7 tributes left. These 7 tributes were Xander from 4, Michigan from 6, Australis from 6, Birch from 7, Flax from 8, Harvest from 9, and Ivory from 11. Later that night, as the fallen tributes were shown in the sky, the girls continued to watch the careers in the cornucopia. The careers were confused about why Michigan, Birch, and Ivory hadn't come to grab their bags yet, but they ultimately decided to leave the bags as a trap. Just then, Australis and Harvest both teamed up against Xander and Flax, This pair actually managed to kill Xander and Flax. Australis and Harvest then began to look around, wondering where the girls were. As Birch watched this, she looked over to Michigan and Ivory, and they both nodded reassuringly to Birch, and the trio ran at Australis and Harvest. Michigan and Ivory tackled Harvest to the ground and fought with him, defending themselves surprisingly well, until Harvest managed to stab Ivory in the stomach. Ivory let a few tears fall before falling off of Harvest and her cannon sounding. Birch then ran at Harvest and immediately threw an axe into his heart, sounding his cannon immediately. After this, the top three looked between each other. Birch and Michigan realized that the only way either of them would have a sliver of a chance at victory, they would have to work together to take down Australis. As the trio began to fight, a hovercraft came into the arena. To the tribute's surprise, President Flickerman came onto the intercoms and stated that due to recent unrest in the districts and the capital, because of some certain pregnant folk in the games were being ended early this year, with the surviving three being considered victors. This surprised Michigan, Australis, and Birch, but they weren't complaining. As the hovercraft came to pick them up, Michigan hugged Birch. Although Birch wasn't too happy about surviving, she wasn't too mad about it either. After the games, Birch never returned home to her family. Birch never returned home. In her family, she was seen as nothing more than a piece of sexual entertainment for her uncle. Birch was also notably nervous about the topic of sexuality in her interview, but during her victory interview, she almost immediately came out as lesbian. This was revealed to be because her family was also very homophobic. Her older sister Bryn would even beat up Birch's gay best friend Ashbrook, until he had no choice but to no longer be friends with her. When Birch had her daughter, she tried getting back in contact with Ashbrook, but this wouldn't work out until after the 201st Hunger Games. Meanwhile, Michigan and Australis returned to District 6, where they tried to open up a training academy together, but it was immediately shut down by the capital due to the fact that President Flickerman didn't want the outlier districts to have an advantage against the careers. Michigan would have a daughter and name her London. London and Birch's daughter Acacia would grow to be very close friends. London and Acacia would actually end up dating and marrying each other at the age of 16 during the 212th Hunger Games. Finally, after returning to District 6, Australis wasn't well liked by anyone. After what the career boys had tried to do to Birch, no one liked Australis for being on their side in the games, no matter how much Australis tried to tell them that he had no idea what the career boys had intended on doing to Birch. After a few months, Australis moved to the capital and started to date Michigan. The pair would end up marrying each other during the 200th Hunger Games. The 197th Games took place in the year 261. After last year's premature ending and trio of victors, viewership of the Hunger Games was dropping. Thankfully, this year's victor would save the games from certain doom, and win in the most bloodthirsty way possible. This year, it was decided that in order to punish the tributes who were saved last year, District 6 and 7 would have to reap 4 tributes in place of the tributes who were saved. This meant that District 6 would be sending in 4 tributes of both genders, and District 7 would be sending in 4 females. This year, Districts 1 and 10 were chosen to send in the extra female tributes, and Districts 2 and 7 were picked to send in the extra male tribute. These are all the mentors for the 197th Hunger Games. If y'all are curious, pause and read at your own leisure. This year's victor was 18-year-old Honolulu Hedstrom from District 6. Honolulu is not a very well-known figure within her district, usually keeping to herself. In school, Honolulu keeps to herself like everywhere else, but she does this to achieve good grades, thinking friends would stop her from achieving her goals, especially because most other people in her district are morphling addicts and wouldn't understand the point of her goals. After Michigan and Australis were saved from this district last year, District 6 had to send in 4 females and 4 males, adding up to 8 tributes altogether coming from District 6. After the reapings of 13-year-old Arabia Batterson, 15-year-old Barbados Alpine, 18-year-old Syria Eastville, 15-year-old Belize Alpine, 18-year-old Herzegovina Eastvale, and 17-year-old Nevis Sorkin, it was time for the last 2 reapings. As the reapings were about to end, Honolulu thought she wouldn't be picked, so when she heard her name get called, she jumped a little. As Honolulu walked towards the aisle, she began to hyperventilate. As she got into the aisle, Honolulu collapsed in a fit of shaking and seizing. This scared some of the District 6 citizens around her, but, as expected, no one volunteered in Honolulu's place. After the reaping of 16-year-old Finnmark Evers, the tributes were taken backstage to be visited by their friends and families. During the visitation period, Honolulu was visited by her younger brother, Athens. Athens immediately pulled Honolulu into a hug, beginning to cry on her shoulder. Honolulu would sigh and rub Athens' back in an attempt to comfort him. After a few minutes of this, Athens calmed down for just long enough to tell Honolulu to win for him, before peacekeepers took him out of the room and escorted Honolulu onto the train. On the train, Honolulu sat in a corner of the main compartment and looked around at the other tributes from her district in deep thought. As she did this, she didn't notice that Arabia was coming to her. When Arabia arrived next to Honolulu, she spoke up, saying hi to Honolulu. Honolulu turned to Arabia in surprise and glared at her before saying hello to her. Just then, Michigan and Australis came into the main compartment and sighed. Australis would take the boys to the gym in the back of the train, while Michigan would take the girls to the main compartment of the train. During training, Honolulu contemplated which station she should start with for a while, ultimately deciding on the spear station. Honolulu would skillfully throw spears at targets. To everyone's surprise, even her own, Honolulu managed to hit most targets in the bullseye. After training for a little while with spears, Honolulu would test her knowledge in poisonous plants and animal station, getting most correct. During the training assessments, Honolulu threw spears at targets, with a surprising amount of accuracy. She would hit 15 out of 20 targets in the bullseye. This would surprise the game makers and evaluators. Honolulu would end up leaving the room with a training score of 11. After the revealing of the training scores, Honolulu was approached by Nevis, who had a score of 10 due to his skill with swords. He stated that he thought Honolulu was very pretty and that the pair of them should celebrate their high training scores by getting intimate while they still had the chance. Although Honolulu thought Nevis looked cute too, she ultimately politely declined his offer. Nevis would nod in understanding before trying his luck with Syria and Herzegovina, a super hot pair of twins, who ultimately accepted Nevis's advances. The interviews took place the next night, and Honolulu stood backstage in a black dress. This was meant to match the color of her district, but after the games it was theorized that this was foreshadowing for what was to come. When Honolulu came out onto the stage, Mia and Tia had just ended the interview of Nevis, who had admitted feelings for Honolulu, which notably pissed the Eastvale twins off as both of them had become pregnant with Nevis's baby. As Honolulu shook hands with Mia and Tia, they both complimented Honolulu's absolutely gorgeous dress. As Honolulu took a seat, Mia and Tia asked Honolulu how she felt about what Nevis had said about her during his interview. Honolulu stated that although she felt honored to have someone have feelings for her, she didn't feel the same way about Nevis. This made the twins less angry at Honolulu and made Nevis feel disappointed. After a few more questions about his life back in District 6, Honolulu got up with a forced smile and bowed before shaking Mia and Tia's hands and walking off of the stage. The next day, the tributes were taken to their launch rooms to be lifted into the arena. As Honolulu waited for Michigan, she looked at the arena outfit. She didn't recognize anything that could immediately tell her what the arena would be, although she did try to decipher what the arena was from the outfit presented to her. Michigan ended up not being able to visit Honolulu, but Honolulu understood that there were just too many tributes to visit this year. As Honolulu was instructed to step into her tube, she put her hair up in a ponytail and stepped into her tube, watching the glass close around her. This year's games took place in an arena known as the Wipeout Obstacle Course. The weather was rain. The main event was an obstacle course reshuffle. The games lasted for 3 days, and there were no notable nuts. As the tributes were lifted into the arena, Honolulu noticed they were in an obstacle course. The tributes from one this year would recognize that this wasn't just any random obstacle course, but instead it was the obstacle course from the hit TV show Wipeout. As Honolulu looked around, she noticed that underneath the obstacles was a pool of water. Just like in the show, there was water to fall into underneath the obstacles in order for contestants in the show to not get hurt. Although, because this was the Hunger Games and not the Wipeout show, the water wasn't just normal water, but instead acid. When the gong sounded, all of the District 6 tributes ran away from the cornucopia except for Honolulu, Herzegovina, and Nevis. As Nevis got to the cornucopia, he grabbed a sword as Honolulu grabbed a spear, and Herzegovina grabbed a knife. Having been beaten to the trident by Azul from 4. As Herzegovina picked up the knife, she looked around, noticing that she was surrounded by armed opponents. Just then, as Honolulu began to fight with Lux from 1, Nevis ran at Herzegovina and stabbed her in the stomach, impaling her. As Herzegovina fell to the ground, Honolulu managed to throw her spear into Lux's heart, sounding his cannon at the same time as Herzegovina's cannon sounded. As Honolulu looked towards Nevis to see who the other cannon belonged to, she saw Herzegovina's dead body and snapped. Honolulu ran in and tackled Nevis to the ground, stabbing her spear into his heart, sounding his cannon. Honolulu then glared at the careers before ultimately slaughtering every single member of the Career Alliance before the careers could get any kills. After slaughtering the careers, Honolulu then ran away in the direction she saw the 9s going in. As she approached Mills and Miliana, both from 9, Mills stood between Honolulu and Miliana, stating that if Honolulu wanted to kill Miliana, she'd have to kill him first. Although Honolulu said nothing before taking her next action, the Capitol figured out that Mills said the wrong thing when confronting Honolulu. Honolulu, filled with bloodlust, threw her spear into Mills's brain, sounding his cannon. She then ran at Miliana and tackled her to the ground, grabbing her spear out of Mills's body. Honolulu then brought the spear above her head and brought it down into Miliana's heart, sounding her cannon. Honolulu then stood up and looked around, glaring at a nearby camera with intense anger and bloodlust in her eyes. At midnight the first night, 23 cannons sounded. These cannons belonged to all 3 tributes from 1, all 3 tributes from 2, Azul from 4, the boy from 4, all 6 tributes from 7, Herzegovina from 6, Nevis from 6, Miliana from 9, Mills from 9, all 3 tributes from 10, and both tributes from District 12. All but one of these tributes being killed by Honolulu. The next day, Honolulu went out to hunt for tributes. As she hunted, she heard 3 more cannons. These cannons belonged to the girls from 5 and 14, along with blocks from 5. These cannons occurred after the pair from 5 had run into each other and the Euro Alliance. Blocks managed to kill the girls from 5 and 14 before Isabel from 15 killed him. As she was hunting, she heard a group of voices approaching her. As she heard these voices, she ducked behind a bush. She looked out of the bush as the voices continued to get closer. Just then, Kane from 14, Isabel, and Max from 15 came into the clearing, right in front of the bush Honolulu was hidden in. In the blink of an eye, Honolulu stabbed her spear through Max's back, sounding his cannon. She then ducked back into the bush before getting caught. As Honolulu ducked back into the bush, Rue from 3 jumped out of a different bush, causing Kane and Isabel to believe it was Rue who had killed Max. As the trio fought, Honolulu watched from her bush until Isabel was stabbed by Rue, sounding her cannon. This made Honolulu fear that she was going to miss out on 2 kills at this point, and she jumped out of the bush, tackling Kane to the ground and stabbing her spear into his heart, sounding his cannon. Honolulu then looked over at Rue with a smirk on her face. This smirk scared Rue and he attempted to run away. Before he could get too far, though, Honolulu threw her spear into Rue's head, sounding his cannon. At this point, it was down to the top 11. The top 11 consisted of Vivi from 3, Arabia from 6, Syria from 6, Honolulu from 6, Barbados from 6, Belize from 6, Finnmark from 6, Angelina from 8, Bartak from 8, Winter from 11, and Caramel from 11. Most of these tributes started off as soloists, with only 5 of the 11 being in an alliance. After this, Honolulu didn't want to miss out on any more kills and ended up hunting for the rest of the day. She would end up killing Angelina from 8, Bartak from 8, Winter from 11, and Caramel from 11, before the fallen were shown. This would leave 7 tributes left by the final day. Vivi from 3, Arabia from 6, Syria from 6, Honolulu from 6, Barbados from 6, Belize from 6, and Finnmark from 6. As the fallen were shown in the sky, Honolulu decided to stay up the rest of the night and hunt for the remaining tributes. Eventually, Honolulu ran into her district partners. As Arabia saw Honolulu, she approached Honolulu and tried to talk to her. None of the other 6s were awake, as Arabia had been on watch. As Arabia approached her, Honolulu put on a smile and tried to try and get her to come closer. As Arabia got right up near Honolulu, Honolulu took out her spear and stabbed it into Arabia's throat, sounding her cannon immediately. The cannon of Arabia surprisingly didn't wake up Syria, Barbados, Belize, and Finnmark. Honolulu walked over to the rest of her district partners and stood over them. Just then, Syria started to stir awake. Before Syria could wake up, Honolulu stabbed her in the heart with her spear, sounding her cannon. Honolulu then went on to kill the boys with her spear. After killing this group from her district, it came to her and the capital's attention that she was one of the tributes in the top 2. The top 2 were then instructed to run to the cornucopia. The reason for this remained unknown until the obstacles in the arena started activating and moving around, resorting themselves. As Honolulu ran, the only thing she could think of was winning and what she would do once she had won. When she got to the cornucopia, she looked around and didn't immediately see her final opponent. Just then, Vivi jumped onto the cornucopia platform and glared at Honolulu. As Vivi did this, Honolulu put on an intense smirk on her face, ready to fight and ready to win. As the girls began to run at each other, Honolulu punching bags came out of the wall and both girls jumped backwards in order to avoid the punching bags. Vivi would land on the edge of the platform, almost falling off of it. As Honolulu noticed this, she ran at Vivi, avoiding all of the punching bags in the process. When she got to Vivi's position, she had just got her footing before being pushed into the acid below by Honolulu. As Vivi's screams grew louder and louder, she begged Honolulu to put her out of her misery. Honolulu just smiled at the sound of Vivi's screams and begging. She wouldn't put Vivi out of her misery and would let her slowly melt away in the acid. When Vivi's screaming went silent and her cannon sounded, Honolulu laughed hysterically as Vivi's bones floated to the top of the acid, them starting to get melted away as well. After her victory, Honolulu returned home where she would be immediately put into a psych ward, where she would be caught laughing about the kills she had performed. Because of her pure insanity, Honolulu was never let out of the psych ward. Because of this, Honolulu would never mentor a District 6 tribute, with Michigan and Australis continuing to mentor District 6 until they could successfully mentor a victor. Honolulu would eventually fall for one of the doctors in the psych ward named Honduras Mendez. Although Honduras didn't feel the same, he ended up being blackmailed into accepting a relationship with Honolulu with photos of Honduras cheating on his wife with a different resident in the psych ward. Honolulu and Honduras would end up having 15 kids together, 13 boys and 2 girls. Honduras would eventually leave his wife of 15 years to be with Honolulu. The reasoning behind this action is still unknown to this day, even though we've had many years to study it. Eventually, Honduras' ex-wife would be killed. Another unresolved case, although we've had years to study it. The 198th Games took place in the year 262. After Honolulu headhunter Hedstrom won last year, the capital's viewership of the games was ramping back up again. The capital wanted more bloodthirsty winners. This year, Districts 11 and 14 were picked to send in the extra female tribute, and Districts 11 and 15 were picked to send in the extra male tribute. These are the mentors for the 198th Hunger Games. If you are curious, pause and read at your own leisure. This year's victor was 16-year-old Agapa Sokova from District 11. Agapa was a very well-known figure within District 11. Although she didn't talk much, as her tongue had been cut out by bullies when she was 7, she had many friends. She also had a loving mother and father, although her mother and father had been divorced since Agapa was 10. As Agapa stood still within the female reaping enclosure, she used sign language to communicate to one of her male friends in the male reaping enclosure, Willem Aker, age 16. Agapa had developed feelings for Willem after she had met him during ninth grade. After the reaping of a pair of Agapa's best friends, Honeysuckle Valhats, aged 18, and her boyfriend Loam Shanks, aged 18, Birch walked over to the female reaping bowl and picked out a name. When Agapa heard her name, she started to cry. As this occurred, she heard someone volunteering. This person was Willem, who immediately walked over to the female reaping enclosure and helped Agapa over to the stage. After Agapa and Willem got onto the stage, the group were all taken backstage for the visitations. During the visitation period, Agapa was visited by her father, Jacob Jetson, aged 49, her mother, Iris Sokova, aged 54, and her stepfather, Jay Sokova, aged 39. Iris and Jay immediately hugged Agapa, and Iris cried, and Iris started to cry. Meanwhile, Jacob and Jay tried to give Agapa some advice on how she could possibly win the games. Although during this period, all Agapa could think about was how her crush Willem had volunteered after she was reaped. Eventually, peacekeepers came into the room and escorted Jacob, Jay, and Iris out of the room and escorted Agapa onto the train. On the train, Agapa sat in a corner and cried before being approached by her friends. The trio of Agapa's friends hugged Agapa tight, promising they'd do whatever they had to in order to protect her. Although they thought this would help, this only made things worse, as Agapa just didn't want to be there, and didn't want to have to kill her best friends. During training, Agapa sat in a corner and cried for a little while, before ultimately standing and deciding to actually train in some skills. She went over to the Toxic Plants and Animal Station, blazing through the station much like Foxface had in the 74th Hunger Games. During training evaluations, Agapa showed off her skills in identifying toxic plants and animals. Although this skill was very boring to the evaluators, they did realize that this was a very important skill to master inside the arena. So, because of the boring yet important skill being shown, Agapa walked away with a score of 6. The interviews took place the next night, and Agapa stood backstage in a tight green dress. As Agapa waited for her interview, Willem talked with her about what he would say in his interview. As Agapa was called out onto the stage, she sighed and walked out onto the stage. As her interview went on, sign language was used by Agapa to communicate to Mia and Tia. Mia and Tia asked many questions about Agapa's life back in District 11. The last question asked to Agapa that night was if she had anybody special waiting for him at home. This caused Agapa to burst into tears and sign that she had a boy that she liked, but that he had come with her to the arena. People didn't really believe this story after how many times this happened previously. The next day, tributes were taken to their launch rooms to be lifted into the arena. As Agapa waited for her mentor, 32-year-old Abutalon Bishop, she paced back and forth around the room. When Abutalon did arrive, he told Agapa not to trust her district partners. Agapa would act as though she took in this information, but deep down inside, she knew her friends were trustworthy. Eventually, Abutalon pushed Agapa into her tube and watched as she was lifted into the arena. This year's games took place in the Garden of Eden. The weather was sunny, the main event was a flood, the games lasted for a week, and the notable months were poisonous snakes. When the podiums rose into the arena, Honeysuckle, Loam, Agapa, and Willem all looked around to see they were in the middle of a beautiful garden. Even Kingsley from 1 and Prince from 1 recognized where this garden was from, signing to the careers that it was a garden in the beginning of the Bible. When the gong sounded, Agapa ran away from the cornucopia with Willem, while Honeysuckle and Loam ran into the cornucopia to get supplies. After a few minutes of cannons going off and Honeysuckle and Loam not returning, Agapa and Willem started to worry about them. This went on until midnight, when the portraits of the fallen were shown. The portraits that were shown during the fallen belonged to the boy from 3, the girl from 4, the boy from 5, Honeysuckle from 11, Loam from 11, the girl from 15, and the boy from 15. When Honeysuckle and Loam's portraits were shown in the sky, Agapa immediately burst into tears. As Agapa cried, Willem hugged her tight and let her cry on his shoulder. After a little while, Agapa pulled away from the hug and looked into Willem's eyes. Willem looked at Agapa with worrisome eyes before Agapa sniffled and pulled Willem into a kiss. As the kiss went on, Agapa and Willem got intimate, causing the cameras to switch over to the careers who were talking about their kills. The next day, Agapa and Willem stayed at their camp until they heard a twig snap nearby. Just then, Dover from 6 jumped out of the bushes and tackled Willem to the ground. In a split second, Dover stabbed Willem in the neck, causing Agapa to snap. Agapa lunged at Dover and snapped his neck in a flurry of intense anger and heartbreak. Just then, Ginny from 6, Penelope from 8, Rue from 9, Rye from 9, and William from 14 jumped out of the bushes, and Ginny tackled Agapa to the ground. Agapa glared at Ginny and used sign language to tell Ginny to make it quick. Just as Ginny was about to bring her sword down into Agapa's neck, Rue and Rye tackled Ginny off of her. As this happened, Penelope pinned Agapa to the ground as William ran away. As Rue and Rye fought Ginny, Agapa took control of her fight against Penelope, pinning her to the ground and beginning to choke her out. As this happened, Penelope tried to beg for her life, but Agapa wouldn't give her the satisfaction, digging her fingertips into Penelope's neck, making her bleed. As Penelope's cannon sounded, Rue and Rye managed to kill Ginny as well. Rue and Rye then looked at Agapa before running away as well. As the pair from 9 ran, Agapa looked quite confused by what had just happened, but she was glad the twins from 9 had saved her. The next few days, 7 cannons sounded, belonging to the girl from 3, the girl from 5, Lubach from 8, Chaparra from 10, William from 14, one of the girls from 14, and Damien from 15. There were still 14 tributes left by the end of the 5th day. The capital was starting to get bored of the games this year, and so, to spice things up, a feast was announced to the 14 remaining tributes. As Agapa contemplated going to the feast, Leviticus announced that for this final year as head game maker, if a tribute doesn't go to the feast, their tracker would be detonated. Agapa would sigh at this, evidently not having any other choice but to go to the feast. As she ran towards the cornucopia, she thought about what would happen at the cornucopia and thought about what she would do if she was attacked there. As she arrived at the cornucopia, she saw Fiona from 14 run for her bag and run around the corner of the cornucopia. Agapa thought Fiona had run away, and so she ran to her bag and grabbed it before running around the corner of the cornucopia in order to get back to camp. Just then, Fiona shot an arrow at Agapa, grazing Agapa's forehead. As Agapa groaned and fell to the ground, Anna and Azriel, the siblings from District 12, ran around the corner and saw Fiona and Agapa fighting, and the pair from 12 cheered for Fiona. Just then, Agapa reached the side and grabbed a nearby knife, stabbing it into Fiona's skull, sounding her cannon immediately. Agapa then stood up and glared at Anna and Azriel. Anna and Azriel looked at Agapa with smirks on their faces, before admitting that they had killed Honeysuckle and Loam. This pissed Agapa off, and she threw her knife into Azriel's skull, sounding his cannon. As this happened, Rue and Rai arrived at the cornucopia and watched as Agapa picked up Azriel's sword and decapitated Anna. Just then, Kingsley and Prince ran at Rue and Rai and tackled them to the ground, as Bowie from 10 tackled Agapa to the ground. As Rue and Rai's cannons sounded, Bowie began to choke Agapa out. Agapa began to cry as Bowie choked her out, which only made Bowie's smirk grow. Just then, Agapa saw Kingsley killing Felling from 7 out of the corner of her eye. As Felling's cannon sounded, Agapa played dead, pretending it was her who died. As Bowie let go of Agapa and attempted to stand up, Agapa grabbed Bowie's ankle and pulled him back down onto the ground and got on top of him, stabbing him multiple times in the stomach, chest, and face with the sword sounding his cannon. As Agapa then grabbed Felling's bag, Rue's bag, Rai's bag, Bowie's bag, Anna's bag, Azriel's bag, and Fiona's bag, along with her own, before running away from the cornucopia and back to camp. After the feast, 7 tributes remained. These 7 tributes were Kingsley from 1, Prince from 1, Diana from 2, Fabius from 2, Gilligan from 4, Cress from 7, and Agapa from 11. On the dawn of the 7th and final day, 4 cannons went off. These 4 cannons belonged to Diana, Fabius, Gilligan, and Cress, after Kingsley and Prince had turned on them and killed them. Just then, Agapa heard trees collapsing behind her. Just then, as she turned around to see what was happening, she heard a scream and a cannon, followed by Prince's photo being shown in the sky. This caused Agapa to realize that Leviticus was trying to get the tributes back to the cornucopia for the finale. As Agapa ran to the cornucopia, she heard a huge wave of water approaching from behind her. As Agapa arrived at the cornucopia, she climbed on top of it and looked as a huge wave of water crashed into the clearing. Just then, Kingsley came up behind Agapa and tackled her to the ground, punching her repeatedly. As soon as Agapa realized she and Kingsley were the only remaining tributes at this point, Agapa started to fight back, punching Kingsley in the neck, causing her to start choking on her own blood. When Kingsley fell off of Agapa, she just stood up and watched as Kingsley slowly choked to death on her own blood. Kingsley begged with sign language for Agapa to put her out of her misery, but Agapa didn't do this and just watched her choke until she died. After her victory, Agapa returned to District 11 and was seen as a hero for bringing another victory to District 11. It took a while for her to get over Willem, but she eventually did after 15 years after her victory. When she turned 31, she met a 30-year-old boy named Lotus Gardner. When Agapa met Lotus, he had just gotten out of a different relationship, a very toxic one. Lotus's relationship with a girl named Goldie Shanks was filled with cheating, abuse, and a general lack of caring for Lotus on Goldie's part. Lotus and Goldie already had one child before breaking up 3 years before he met Agapa. This kid was 6 by the time Agapa and Lotus married. This child's name was Jacob Gardner. Jacob would go on to compete in and win in future games. Agapa and Lotus would have 2 kids together, 1 girl and 1 boy. Lenario and Hydrangea would not end up competing in future games, opting to live a more happy and fulfilling life within District 11 with their parents and Jacob. The 199th games took place in the year 263. After the District 11 victory the year prior, the capital's viewership was semi-decent. As reaping parties occurred in the capital, the family of this year's victor were giving this year's victors some last-minute training. This year, Districts 2 and 6 were picked to send in the extra female tribute, and Districts 4 and 9 were picked to send in the extra male tribute. This year's games would yet again save the games from certain doom, due to the very interesting arena and very interesting kills. These are the mentors for the 199th Hunger Games. If you are curious, pause and read at your own leisure. Let's go. This year's victor was 17-year-old Cepheus Becker from District 2. Cepheus is a very well-known figure within his district. He's known for being related to not 1, but 2 victors. He's the nephew of both Maximus and Aphenia. His mother, Jezebel Becker, had him when she was 15 and is now considered a MILF by many men in the district, making Cepheus feel like he needs to be protective over his mom. This year, Cepheus, his little sister Arabelle, aged 15, and his cousin Taylor Allard, aged 18, volunteered for the Reaping Games, along with many others. In the mud pits, Cepheus would camouflage within the mud, and when a tribute would step over him, he would pop up out of the mud and trip the tribute before ripping all their bracelets off. He would end up using this tactic to remove 30 out of 42 volunteers from the competition. He would end up being crowned as the male tribute this year. After Arabelle and Taylor were crowned the female tributes for District 2 this year, it was time for the visitations. Cepheus was visited by his mom Jezebel, aged 32. Jezebel hugged Cepheus tightly and smiled. She would tell Cepheus that he had been training his whole life for this moment and that he was going to do great in the arena. Cepheus would smile and nod, hugging Jezebel. After a few minutes of Jezebel talking strategy with Cepheus, peacekeepers came into the room to escort Jezebel out of the room and escort Cepheus onto the train. On the train, Cepheus, Arabelle, and Taylor talked with each other until Maximus and Aphenia came into the main train compartment. When in the main train compartment, Maximus immediately congratulated Taylor, Arabelle, and Cepheus on becoming the District 2 tributes this year. After a little while, Maximus took Cepheus to the gym in the back of the train, while Taylor and Arabelle were taken to the diner cart by Aphenia. During training, Cepheus showed certain amounts of ADHD as he trained in multiple different stations but got distracted quite easily by the other available stations. He ended up training in medical, spears, electrical, toxicology, throwing knives, swords, hand-to-hand combat, hammock making, and fishhook making. By the end of training, Cepheus had trained in almost every single training station. The night before training evaluations, the boy from 1 came into the District 2 apartment with blood all over him. It was immediately noticed by the trio from 2 that the boy had killed his district partner. This realization led to a huge fight between the 2s and the boy from 1. As the fight went on, the tributes from 4, 7, 10, and 12 went into District 2's apartment in order to meet the other careers. As these careers saw the 1s and 2s fighting, Harbor from 4, Kraken from 4, Hesper from 7, L from 10, and Fleming from 12 joined in on the fight, taking down the boy from 1, with Hesper delivering the killing blow with a kitchen knife. After this fight was done, the careers started to converse, talking strategy. Eventually, Arabelle, Taylor, Jenny from 4, Hemlockette from 7, Doe from 10, and Curel from 12 joined in on the conversation. During training evaluations, Cepheus showed his skills with spears. He threw 12 spears at 12 different targets, hitting 7 targets. He missed most of the targets due to the fact that his mind was on something else, or rather, someone else. Cepheus would end up leaving the evaluation room with a score of 7. After the reveal of the training scores, the tributes from 4, 7, 10, and 12 came into the District 2 apartment. The group would talk about their training scores and if they should invite extra people from the outlying districts into the Career Alliance. After a while, the careers decided to invite 4chan from 3, who scored an 11, and Faro from 9, who scored the only 12 this year. The group decided that they would go to the District 3 apartment first, since it was only the next floor up. The interviews took place the next night, and Cepheus stood backstage in a nice golden suit. After Taylor's interview, Cepheus walked out onto the stage with a smile on his face. After being complimented on his suit by Mia and Tia, he sat down across from them and the interview started. Cepheus's questions were more targeted towards his home life, training, and love life. Cepheus's last question was if he had someone special waiting for him at home. He then admitted that he had feelings for a crazy hot brunette back at home named Junia Alfayed. This caused cheers throughout the crowd as Cepheus elegantly bowed and walked off the stage. The next day, the tributes were taken into the launch rooms underneath the arena. In Cepheus's launch room, Cepheus waited for Maximus to come into his launch room. As he waited, Cepheus looked at the arena clothing offered and tried to guess what the arena was, unable to do so accurately. When Maximus came into the room, he immediately brought Cepheus into a tight hug. After a few minutes of talking and hugging, Maximus pushed Cepheus into his launch tube and watched the glass close around him. This year's games took place in an arena known as Acid Lakes. The weather was thunderstorms, the main event was acid rain, the games lasted for 3 days, and the notable months were mutants. As the tributes were lifted into the arena, Cepheus looked around and saw huge lakes of acid surrounding the cornucopia. The cornucopia itself was also in the middle of its own acid lake, with bridges leading from the podiums to the cornucopia and also from the podiums to the outside rim of the cornucopia lake. Another thing Cepheus noticed while looking around was that the boy from 15 was on the podium right next to him, sharing a bridge with the boy. When the gong sounded, both Cepheus and the boy from 15 began to run towards the cornucopia, but before the boy from 15 could get very far on the bridge, however, Cepheus grabbed him and lifted him into the air before dunking him into the acid lake head first. His squirming and muffled screams of pain and agony were eventually silenced by his cannon. Most of the bloodbath kills this year were by Cepheus in the same manner as he had killed the boy from 15, using that same strategy to kill the girl from 5, the girl from 8, the other boy from 9, and the girl from 14. Meanwhile, Pharaoh had killed the other two solos, the boy from 5 and 6. He did this by decapitating the pair with a scythe he had grabbed from the cornucopia. As the anti-careers ran away from the cornucopia, as the careers watched, Elle and Fleming called the anti-careers chickens. Meanwhile, 4chan, Pharaoh, and the trios from Districts 2 and 4 agreed that the anti-careers were very tactically minded this year. The careers had thought that the anti-careers didn't get any kills. This thought persisted until Hesper fell to the ground and a cannon sounded. It was revealed that while the other careers were grabbing weapons, Hesper and Henriette from 15 got into a fight over an axe at the cornucopia. When Henriette got a hold of the axe, she inflicted a deadly wound on Hesper's shoulder before running away. When the careers noticed this, they noticed that the anti-careers should still be looked out for this year, like other years. As the night went on, the cameras would switch out who would stay on watch. The careers would switch out who would stay on watch. They had decided to watch in pairs, with Cepheus being paired with Hemlockette. When Cepheus and Hemlockette were woken up for the last night shift, the pair sat on the edge of camp and talked for a little while. Hemlockette, being only 13, seemed very interested in the girl that Cepheus had talked about in his interview. Cepheus seemed happy to talk about the girl, saying he has had a crush on her since they met in elementary school. As the pair talked, Hemlockette heard a twig snap and covered Cepheus's mouth as he was talking. Another twig then snapped, and Cepheus was at full alert now as well, knowing that it was just the careers and the anti-careers left. Cepheus and Hemlockette slowly reached for their weapons until they heard the bushes nearby rustling. They looked in that direction before being ambushed by gigantic cockroaches. Hemlockette and Cepheus both screamed and picked up their weapons and started swinging at the roaches. Cepheus and Hemlockette's screams woke up the other careers, and they immediately noticed a few bodies of a few of the massive roaches. This realization caused 4chan to mutter a word that none of the other careers recognized: rad roaches. It was revealed by the game makers that the mutts this year were indeed mutants from the famous old world game series known as Fallout. As the careers fought these roaches, it was revealed that the anti-careers were also fighting their own roaches on the opposite side of the arena. It was also revealed by the game makers that the mutts will be different each night. Tonight it was rad roaches, tomorrow night would be blood bugs, and the next night would be bloat flies. After their fight with the roaches, 3 careers had died to them:
Harbor from 4, Doe from 10, and Fleming from 12. Meanwhile, the anti-careers had lost 5. Daytona from 6, Decor from 8, Frida from 9, Geranium from 11, and Lionel from 14. This all meant that only 14 tributes remained. These 14 tributes were Arabelle from 2, Taylor from 2, Cepheus from 2, Flick from 3, 4chan from 3, Jenny from 4, Kraken from 4, Florida from 6, Hemlockette from 7, Faro from 9, Elle from 10, Daphne from 11, Curel from 12, and Henriette from 15. The next night, only 2 tributes died to the Bloodbugs, Flick and 4chan, both from 3. Meanwhile, this was also the night that the careers turned on Faro. Faro had managed to kill Jenny and Curel in the chaos before being killed himself by Kraken after Faro had killed Jenny, Kraken's girlfriend. That night, as Cepheus and Hemlockette talked after all the chaos, Cepheus said that they were getting close to the finale. This caused Hemlockette to pause and think for a moment before stating that she didn't trust the other careers, to which Cepheus agreed. The pair then decided to kill the other careers in their sleep that night. It was decided by the pair that Cepheus would take on Kraken and Elle, while Hemlockette took out Arabelle and Taylor. The pair then put their plan into effect. Cepheus and Hemlockette easily killed Elle and Taylor first. They then looked at their other targets as the first cannon sounded. To their surprise, Kraken and Arabelle weren't woken up by these cannons, and Cepheus and Hemlockette also easily managed to kill them as well. The next day it started to rain. Florida, Daphne, and Henriette were safe under their shelter until the acid started to melt their shelter. This caused them to run towards the cornucopia. Meanwhile, Cepheus and Hemlockette had to run directly to the cornucopia as they had no shelter. Cepheus and Hemlockette arrived at the cornucopia first and heard 2 cannons in the distance. Just then, Florida burst into the cornucopia clearing with a crazed look on her face. Cepheus told Hemlockette to stand behind him as Florida got closer to them. Cepheus then took out his sword as Florida arrived at the island in the middle of the acid lake the cornucopia was set on. Once she got under the cornucopia, she took out her knife, covered in the blood of Daphne and Henriette. While Cepheus and Florida fought, Hemlockette noticed that Cepheus was losing his strength in the fight. So, in an action that Hemlockette didn't think out very well, Hemlockette dove in between Cepheus and Florida. Florida and Hemlockette fought for a surprisingly long time until Florida stabbed Hemlockette in the gut with her knife. As Hemlockette fell, Cepheus snapped. Cepheus swung his sword around frantically at Florida, managing to stab her in the gut, before being stabbed in the gut himself. As Cepheus fell to the ground, to his surprise, Hemlockette found the strength to get up and finish Florida off before her cannon also sounded, making Cepheus the victor. Although he had won, Cepheus wasn't out of the woods yet. Cepheus would go in and out of consciousness until peacekeepers came into the arena to grab him. During the month Cepheus was in the hospital, his victory tour and Victor's interview were cancelled preemptively, as the capital thought he would die to his injuries. They even made a memorial video to show after his death. To everyone's surprise, Cepheus would awaken on his 18th birthday, April 5th, the next year. This would be only 3 months before the 200th Hunger Games. After Cepheus woke up, he would eventually ask Junia out on a date. She would decline this because while Cepheus was asleep due to his injuries, she had thought he died, and so she started to date someone else. This broke Cepheus' heart, but he understood why Junia had done this. 2 weeks before the 200th Hunger Games, Cepheus would officially move to the capital. In the capital, Cepheus would fall for a girl named Vivian Creed. Cepheus and Vivian would eventually get married, and they would have a record 19 kids together, 14 girls and 5 boys. None of these kids would end up competing in the Hunger Games, but their youngest girl, Lavinia Becker, would become the District 6 stylist during the 225th Games at the age of 10. All the way until the 300th Hunger Games, just before her 85th birthday. So yeah, guys, that is the end of episode 10 of Ashes of the Hunger Games. I hope you all enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun making it and writing it. Had a lot of fun finding the pictures for these arenas. Oh my gosh, my friends keep spamming the group chat. I'm sure you noticed that throughout the video. But geez, guys, calm down while I'm working. I should have put my notifications on mute, but that's fine. Anyways, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, then slap that like button. As always, stay awesome. Good luck, tributes, and may the odds be ever in your favor. Goodbye, everybody.